Before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, and before the gods of Egypt filled temple walls, a river was already shaping one of the greatest civilizations in history. Welcome to Sleepy Hidden History. Tonight, we'll follow the full story of ancient Egypt, from its earliest settlements and powerful rulers to Cleopatra and the final days of the pharaohs. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And please like and subscribe. It may seem small, but it truly means a lot to me. Thank you. Long before Egypt had pharaohs, pyramids, or golden masks, there was only a river moving through a landscape that was slowly becoming less forgiving. If you could stand in northeastern Africa more than 7,000 years ago, the world around you would not look exactly like the Egypt we know today. Parts of the Sahara were greener, seasonal lakes dotted regions that are now dry, and people moved through grasslands where cattle grazed and wild animals gathered near water. But the climate was changing. Rainfall became less reliable, the open country gradually dried, and communities were drawn toward the one source of life that did not simply disappear: the Nile. This migration was not a single dramatic exodus, and archaeologists still debate how different groups moved, mixed, and adapted. But the broad pattern is clear. As surrounding lands became harsher, the narrow river valley grew more important. The Nile offered opportunity, but only to people capable of understanding its rhythms, cooperating across seasons, and surviving the years when those rhythms failed. Each summer, waters rising from far to the south spread across the floodplain, leaving behind dark, fertile soil. When the water withdrew, farmers planted emmer wheat and barley, raised cattle, sheep, and goats, gathered flax for linen, and depended on fish, birds, and river plants. Yet the flood was never a perfectly obedient clock. Too little water could mean hunger. Too much could destroy homes, fields, and stored food. The same river that fed a village could erase it. That tension between abundance and danger may help explain one of the deepest ideas that later defined Egyptian culture. Order was precious, because chaos was always close. Along the Nile, small settlements grew into stable communities. Houses made from mud, reeds, and timber rarely survived well, so much of what we know comes not from the homes of the living, but from the graves of the dead. In cemeteries associated with the Badarian culture during the 5th millennium BC, bodies were placed in simple pits, often curled on their sides and accompanied by pottery, beads, tools, or stone pallets used to grind pigments. Beside the dead, these objects carried another meaning. They suggest that possessions, identity, and perhaps some form of continued existence were already being imagined beyond death. No written explanation survives, so we cannot know precisely what these people believed. But their care for the dead reveals that burial had become more than disposal. It had become memory, status, and ritual. Over time, differences between graves became harder to ignore. Some contained only a few objects. Others held finely made pottery, jewelry, carved ivory, stone vessels, and goods that required specialized labor or materials brought from far away. A larger tomb does not identify a king, but it shows that certain people commanded resources unavailable to others. Leadership was becoming more permanent, wealth more concentrated, and communities more connected to emerging elites. By around 4000 BC, cultures grouped by archaeologists under the name Naqada were developing strongly in Upper Egypt, the southern stretch of the Nile Valley. The geography can sound backward to modern ears. Upper Egypt was in the south because it lay upstream, while Lower Egypt was in the north, where the river descended into the broad delta before reaching the Mediterranean. Important southern centers such as Naqada, Abydos, and Nekhen, later called Hierakonpolis, grew in influence. Their workshops produced black-topped pottery, painted jars, sharp flint blades, carved handles, cosmetic palettes, and increasingly sophisticated objects of stone and metal. The finest pieces communicated power. Boats, animals, processions, combat and ritual scenes appeared on pottery and ceremonial objects, giving us glimpses of a symbolic world that was already becoming recognizably Egyptian, even though many meanings remain hidden. Boats were especially important. The Nile was not a barrier dividing Egypt. It was the road that joined it. A vessel could carry grain, stone, livestock, pottery, officials, warriors, and ideas far more efficiently than people could move over land. Control of river traffic meant access to trade and influence, and eventually the ability to project power beyond one town's fields. Egyptian communities also looked outward. Goods and materials reveal contact with Nubia to the south, the eastern deserts, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Levant beyond Egypt's northeastern edge. Gold, copper, stone, oils, timber, shells, and exotic objects moved through networks already extensive before the first dynasty began. Early Egypt was not born in isolation. Its people developed distinctive traditions, but they also exchanged materials and ideas with neighboring regions. The harder question is how much those connections influenced the rise of writing, royal imagery, administration, and long-distance trade. Similarities do not always prove direct borrowing, so the evidence must be handled carefully. What can be seen with greater confidence is the spread of Naqada material culture northward. By the later 4th millennium BC, styles and practices associated with Upper Egypt appeared across a much larger area. This could reflect migration, trade, political expansion, elite imitation, intermarriage, or some combination of them. It probably was not one clean wave of conquest. Civilization rarely advances in the tidy sequence later kings preferred to carve on monuments. It grows through negotiations, rivalries, marriages, shortages, opportunities, and violence, leaving behind an archaeological record full of missing pages. As communities expanded, administrators needed ways to identify goods, places, owners, and quantities. Around 3200 BC, some of the earliest known Egyptian writing appeared, including small labels and signs connected with royal or elite administration. These early marks were compact tools of control and memory, recording names, commodities, institutions, or destinations. Writing may later have become sacred and monumental, but one of its earliest powers was practical. It allowed authority to reach farther than a human voice. A ruler who could count stores, mark shipments, identify estates, and preserve names could govern in ways no village chief could. At the same time, images of leaders became more forceful. Ceremonial mace heads, carved knife handles, and decorated palettes showed large human figures dominating enemies, animals, and ordered processions. Their scale was political. The most important person appeared largest because the image described rank, not eyesight. By the time of King Narmer, around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, many elements of Egyptian kingship had taken a form that would endure for centuries. On the famous Narmer palette, the king wears the white crown associated with Upper Egypt on one side and the red crown associated with Lower Egypt on the other. He strikes a defeated enemy in a pose repeated by Egyptian rulers for roughly 3,000 years. Bodies appear in disciplined rows, while divine symbols share the same visual world as soldiers and officials. It is tempting to read the palette as a snapshot of the single battle that united Egypt, and it may preserve the memory of real conflict, but its purpose was ceremonial rather than journalistic. Some scholars see it as a commemoration of political unification. Others emphasize ritual, cosmic order, or the repeated royal claim to defeat chaos. The safest conclusion is also the most revealing. By Narmer's time, unification had become both a political achievement and a sacred idea. Egypt was no longer presented as a collection of river communities. It was becoming the two lands, different in geography, yet held under one ruler. Narmer is often credited as the unifier, sometimes linked with the later name Menes, but the process likely began before him and continued after him. Earlier southern rulers had expanded their reach, while the first kings still had to secure territories, organize officials, and make unity real beyond carved stone. A crown could symbolize control, long before every village accepted it. A kingdom stretching along hundreds of miles of river required information, transport, storage, ritual authority, and cooperation across communities with local identities of their own. The Nile made such a state possible, but people built it through generations of experimentation. They learned when to plant and harvest, how to store grain, where to obtain stone and metal, how to move cargo by boat, how to honor the dead, how to display rank, and finally, how to turn signs and images into instruments of government. By about 3100 BC, those separate achievements had begun to lock together. Agriculture supported specialists. Specialists produced prestige goods. Prestige reinforced elites. Elites controlled trade and labor. Writing strengthened administration. Ritual transformed political power into something larger than an individual life. And above it all emerged the figure of the king, not yet commonly called pharaoh in the way later generations would use the word, but already portrayed as the human force standing between order and disorder. The river had not simply created Egypt. It had placed people inside a narrow corridor where survival rewarded coordination, surplus could become power, and control of movement could become control of a country. At the end of the pre-dynastic age, the foundations were ready. A united territory, an emerging bureaucracy, royal symbols, writing, trade networks, specialized labor, and a belief that political order reflected something cosmic. What remained was to make that order permanent. The earliest kings would attempt exactly that by building tombs larger than any ordinary home, surrounding themselves with officials, and turning government into sacred tradition. But within only a few centuries, one ruler would demand something no earlier community along the Nile had ever seen. A monument not of mud brick, but of stone, rising above the desert like a staircase built for a king to climb into eternity. Unity on a ceremonial palette was one thing. Ruling the Nile Valley day after day was something far more difficult. The earliest kings inherited a country that could be imagined as one kingdom, but imagination alone could not collect grain, settle disputes, move stone, command labor, or keep distant communities loyal. To make Egypt real, the crown had to reach into ordinary life, and during the First and Second dynasties, roughly between 3100 and 2686 BC, that reach became steadily more organized. The king stood at the center of this new system, though the title pharaoh would not become the normal name for Egypt's rulers until much later. Royal names appeared inside a rectangular emblem called a serek, topped by the falcon god Horus. The message was powerful. The ruler did not merely receive protection from Horus. He acted as Horus within the human world. His duty was to hold the two lands together, defend the borders, satisfy the gods, and prevent disorder from breaking through the fragile structure of society. Later Egyptians would express this ideal through Ma'at, the balance of truth, justice, and cosmic order. But its political meaning was already taking shape. A failed harvest, a rebellion, or an uncontrolled frontier was not only an administrative problem, it could be understood as a crack in the order the king was expected to maintain. Yet no ruler, however sacred his image, could personally supervise hundreds of settlements. The first Egyptian state depended on people whose names rarely survive. scribes marking containers, officials measuring fields, boat crews carrying supplies, estate managers directing workers, and local leaders negotiating with the court. Their work turned royal symbolism into practical power. Small ivory and bone labels from this age record names, places, ceremonies, and deliveries. Clay ceilings closed jars, boxes, and storerooms, identifying the authority responsible for their contents. These objects may look less impressive than a crown, but they reveal the real machinery behind kingship. Grain from a royal estate, oil from the delta, timber from abroad, or stone from a quarry could be counted, marked, stored, and redirected. Writing allowed the palace to remember what one person could not, and once information could travel with goods, royal authority could travel with it. Near the point where the narrow valley opened into the delta, a major center developed in the region later known as Memphis. Egyptian tradition credited its foundation to Menes, the legendary unifier, but its exact beginnings remain difficult to reconstruct. What matters is its position. From there, the crown could watch the meeting place between Upper and Lower Egypt, control river traffic, and communicate with both the valley to the south and the delta to the north. Memphis became a political hinge holding the country together. Its earliest buildings have mostly vanished beneath later occupation and the changing floodplain, yet the logic of the location is unmistakable. The Nile favored unity, but it did not guarantee it. The river could carry officials and food, but also rivals, rumors, and armies. A court near the center of movement had a better chance of stopping distant trouble before it became permanent separation. Royal power was also made visible through journeys, festivals, and ceremonial appearances. Early records mention events that may have involved following Horus, touring the land, counting wealth, or marking religious festivals. The details are uncertain because later sources preserve only compressed names, but the pattern suggests a government that used movement and spectacle to reinforce administration. Officials did not arrive merely to collect resources. They appeared as representatives of a sacred order in which taxation, ritual, and loyalty were closely woven together. Grain was crucial because Egypt did not yet use coined money. Agricultural surplus could feed workers, support craftsmen, provision expeditions, maintain shrines, and reward officials. Palace and temple estates gathered produce into storage facilities, then redistributed it according to need and rank. This was not a modern national economy directed from a single office, and local arrangements must have varied, but control over stored food gave the crown enormous influence. A ruler who commanded grain could turn seasons of abundance into monuments, military strength, and political loyalty. The state also expanded through trade and organized expeditions. Groups moved toward Sinai for copper and turquoise, into the eastern deserts for valuable stone, and south toward Nubia for gold, ivory, incense, animal products, and access to African trade routes. Contact with the Levant brought timber, wine, oils, and crafted goods. Some encounters were peaceful, others were backed by force. Royal images often showed defeated enemies from desert or foreign lands, but these scenes were political statements rather than neutral reports of single battles. They declared that the king had pushed disorder away from Egypt's protected center. Still, archaeology confirms that the court was increasingly capable of organizing long-distance movement. Every expedition required supplies, boats or pack animals, guides, guards, and records. The achievement was not simply reaching a mine or distant settlement. It was building a chain of authority strong enough to bring the materials home. Death offered the crown an even greater stage on which to display its power. At Abydos, in the cemetery now called el-Kab, early kings built large underground tombs surrounded by chambers filled with food, wine, tools, furniture, and ritual objects. These tombs were not pyramids, and much of what stood above them has disappeared. But their scale separated royal burial from ordinary death. The ruler was expected to continue beyond the grave, and the court prepared an entire material world for that continuation. Around several First Dynasty tombs, archaeologists found subsidiary burials containing servants, officials, and possibly members of the royal household. Many scholars interpret them as evidence of retainer sacrifice, meaning that some individuals may have been buried at the time of the king's funeral to accompany him into the next world. The precise circumstances remain debated, but the custom appears to have faded quickly. Later rulers replaced human attendants with images, models, and eventually funerary figures. If sacrifice occurred, it reveals how far royal hierarchy could extend when power was imagined to continue beyond death. The royal cemetery also exposes a more complicated truth. The first state was not shaped by men alone. Queen Mernith received a burial at Abydos of extraordinary importance, with surrounding graves and objects bearing her name. She may have governed as regent for the young King Den, and some scholars have asked whether she should be counted as a ruler in her own right. The evidence does not completely settle the question, but her position was exceptional. Royal women could transmit legitimacy, manage estates, participate in cults, and stabilize succession when a child inherited the throne. In a system built around sacred bloodlines, motherhood and marriage were political institutions. Den, one of the better attested First Dynasty kings, seems to have ruled during a period of growing royal confidence. He appears wearing the double crown in one of its earliest surviving representations, while inscriptions from his reign suggest ceremonies, campaigns, and administrative development. Yet even a strong king could not eliminate rivalry. The Second Dynasty is much harder to reconstruct, and the uncertain order of its rulers may reflect political instability. Some kings are better documented in the north and others in the south, leading historians to consider whether Egypt temporarily divided or rival courts competed for recognition. Peribsen made the extraordinary decision to place the animal of Seth above his royal name, instead of the falcon of Horus. Seth was not simply an evil god in early Egyptian belief. He represented dangerous power, the desert, and disruptive forces. Even so, replacing Horus in the royal emblem was unusual enough to suggest a major political or religious statement. Perhaps Peribsen controlled only part of Egypt. Perhaps he favored a different cult. Or perhaps modern interpretations make the conflict appear sharper than it was. The evidence permits several possibilities. The tension appears to resolve under Kasekemwi, whose name can be understood as the two powers appear. His emblem included both Horus and Seth, possibly proclaiming reconciliation after division. Inscriptions from his reign referred to defeated northern enemies, though whether they describe civil war, rebellion, or symbolic victory is uncertain. By the end of his rule, the state appears stable again, and royal building reached a new level. His tomb at Abydos was larger and more complex than those of many predecessors, while a massive mud brick enclosure nearby demonstrated the crown's ability to command labor on an impressive scale. Kasekemwe stood at the edge of a transformation. For centuries, Egypt's rulers had tested the tools of centralized power: sacred titles, written records, taxation, royal estates, river transport, provincial administration, foreign expeditions, ceremonial journeys, and monumental burial. The system remained vulnerable to weak succession and regional rivalry, but it had become durable enough to survive crisis. Then came Djoser of the Third Dynasty, and with him a startling change in ambition. At Saqqara, overlooking the capital region, his court abandoned the idea that a royal monument should remain close to the earth. Under the direction of officials traditionally associated with Imhotep, stone was cut and arranged on a scale Egypt had never attempted before. What began as a rectangular tomb was expanded upward, stage by stage, until it became a vast staircase rising from the desert. The first kings had built a state strong enough to count its wealth and command its people. Djoser was about to use that state to build a mountain. The first great stone mountain did not rise all at once. At Saqqara, Djoser's monument began as a low, rectangular mastaba, the familiar shape of an elite tomb. But the plan kept changing. Builders enlarged it, raised it, and added layer upon layer until 6 steps stood above the desert. Around it stretched a sacred landscape of courtyards, shrines, gateways, storage rooms, and ceremonial buildings, many carved in stone to imitate structures once made from reeds, timber, and mud brick. The complex was not simply a burial place. It was a permanent stage on which the dead king could continue performing the rituals of rule, renewing his strength and maintaining Egypt's order after death. Tradition later celebrated Imhotep as Djoser's brilliant official and master builder, and he was eventually honored as a figure of wisdom and healing. But a project of this scale could never have been the work of one mind alone. Surveyors, quarrymen, stonecutters, haulers, scribes, overseers, and boat crews had to act as parts of a system, becoming more precise with every generation. The step pyramid proved that stone could be organized on a monumental scale. What followed was not an effortless march toward perfection, but decades of dangerous experimentation. During the reign of Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, Egyptian builders attempted more pyramid construction than under almost any other king. At Meidum, a stepped structure was transformed toward the form of a true pyramid, though much of its outer mass later collapsed, leaving the strange, tower-like core seen today. Whether the final collapse occurred during construction or long afterward remains debated, but the monument preserves evidence of a design being pushed beyond earlier experience. At Dashur, the bent pyramid tells the story even more clearly. Its sides rise steeply, then suddenly change to a shallower angle partway up. The shift may have been a response to cracks, instability, pressure within the masonry, or a desire to finish the structure more safely. Whatever the exact reason, it reveals builders adapting while the project was still alive. Sneferu's next great monument, the Red Pyramid, rose at a gentler angle from the beginning and became the earliest completed large true pyramid known in Egypt. By the end of his reign, the essential geometry had been mastered, but mastery did not mean every mystery had been solved. Even now, scholars debate the combinations of ramps, levers, sledges, roads, and lifting systems used at different stages. No surviving blueprint explains the process, and it is unlikely that one method served every monument from foundation to summit. What the evidence shows is more impressive than any fantasy of lost machines. The Egyptians solved each problem with observation, organization, repeated testing, and an enormous command of human effort. Sneferu's son Khufu inherited that knowledge and directed it toward Giza, where the desert plateau rose above the floodplain near the capital region. There, sometime in the 26th century BC, the Great Pyramid began to take shape. Originally about 481 feet high, it remained the world's tallest human-made structure for thousands of years. Its core was built largely from local limestone, while fine white limestone from Tura formed the outer casing and granite from Aswan was used in important internal spaces. Most of the casing is gone, but when complete, the monument would have caught the sunlight as a sharply defined form. Inside, narrow passages lead through a structure whose arrangement continues to invite argument. The so-called King's Chamber, the chamber traditionally called the Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, shafts, relieving spaces, and other voids have generated competing interpretations. Some features clearly served structural or ritual purposes. Others remain uncertain. Modern scanning has revealed previously unknown empty spaces, including a large void above the Grand Gallery. But discovery is not the same as explanation. It may relate to construction, weight distribution, or an internal feature whose purpose has not yet been established. The pyramid still keeps secrets, though not the supernatural kind often imposed upon it. Its real mystery lies in decisions made by builders whose practical knowledge was never written down for us. One surviving voice from Khufu's reign brings the project closer than speculation ever could. The papyri discovered at Wadi el-Jarf include the logbook of an official named Marir, who supervised a crew transporting fine limestone from the Tura quarries toward the Great Pyramid complex. His records describe routine journeys, deliveries, and movements through waterways connected to the construction zone. They do not explain how the highest blocks were raised, but they reveal a disciplined logistical network. Teams with names, schedules, supervisors, food supplies, boats, and administrative checkpoints. Giza was not an isolated building site surrounded by silence. It was a crowded landscape of harbors, workshops, bakeries, storage facilities, roads, housing, temples, and cemeteries. Archaeological remains associated with the workforce show that the builders were not simply an army of foreign slaves driven until death, as later legends and popular films often suggest. The labor force probably included permanent skilled workers, alongside rotating groups recruited or required from communities across Egypt, especially when the annual flood reduced agricultural work. They were housed, organized, and provisioned with bread, beer, meat, fish, and other supplies. Their bones show heavy strain, but some injuries had healed, suggesting care rather than abandonment. Crew names found in hidden areas of the pyramid, including names expressing loyalty to Khufu, also hint at organized identity and pride. None of this means the work was easy or entirely voluntary by modern standards. A centralized monarchy could demand service, and the physical cost must have been severe. But the people who built Giza were part of Egyptian society, and their labor connected villages throughout the kingdom to a royal project intended to outlast them all. Khufu's successor, Djedefre, chose Abu Rawash for his pyramid, while Khafre returned to Giza and built the second Great Pyramid. Because Khafre's monument stands on slightly higher ground and still preserves casing stone near its summit, it can appear taller, though it was originally smaller than Khufu's. His complex is closely associated with the Great Sphinx, the colossal, lion-bodied figure carved from the plateau's natural limestone. Most Egyptologists place the Sphinx in Khafre's reign, partly because of its location and relationship to his temples, though questions about its precise symbolism and the identity represented by its face continue to invite discussion. It likely joined royal power to solar and leonine imagery, guarding the sacred horizon where the king's transformation was imagined to occur. Menkora completed the trio with a much smaller pyramid, but smaller did not mean insignificant. Parts of its casing used granite, and sculpture from his complex includes some of the most refined royal images of the Old Kingdom. The reduction may reflect changing priorities, resources, or royal religion rather than a sudden loss of skill. By the 5th dynasty, kings increasingly built at Saqqara and Abu Sir, and the cult of the sun god Ra became more visible through royal names, solar temples, and pyramid architecture. The pyramid itself was only one part of a carefully arranged journey. A valley temple near the cultivation edge connected by a causeway to a mortuary temple beside the pyramid. Offerings were brought, priests performed rituals, and royal estates supplied the cult. The dead king's continued existence required living people, fields, animals, records, and daily work. Eternity had an economy. Inside the earliest Great Pyramids, the walls were largely bare. But late in the 5th dynasty, the burial chambers of King Unas were covered with lines of hieroglyphs now called the pyramid texts. These spells, hymns, commands, and ritual utterances helped the king overcome dangers, join the gods, ascend to the sky, and secure food forever. They did not form a single orderly book. They were a changing body of sacred language, copied and rearranged in later royal tombs. Their appearance makes the pyramid's inner purpose more audible. The king might rise among the imperishable stars, travel with the sun, become united with Osiris, or command divine beings to open the path before him. Different images of the afterlife existed side by side because Egyptian religion did not always demand one exclusive explanation. Stone gave the king permanence, but words gave him movement. During the 6th dynasty, officials in the provinces built increasingly elaborate tombs and recorded their careers with growing confidence. Their inscriptions reveal local governors organizing expeditions, managing shortages, leading troops, and presenting themselves as protectors of their communities. Their rise did not automatically destroy royal authority. The crown often depended on powerful provincial families. Yet, over generations, offices could become hereditary. Local wealth could remain outside direct royal control, and the balance between court and provinces became harder to manage. The exceptionally long reign traditionally assigned to Pepi II may have created succession difficulties, though its exact length remains debated. Environmental stress may also have contributed. Evidence indicates episodes of reduced Nile flooding and wider climatic disruption near the end of the 3rd millennium BC. But climate alone cannot explain political collapse. A low flood becomes a national disaster only when institutions cannot respond effectively. Economic strain, contested succession, provincial independence, and declining confidence in the center may have reinforced one another. The Pyramid Age did not end because Egyptians forgot how to build. It ended because the political world that had made the largest monuments possible was changing. At Giza, the pyramids still shone above the river, proclaiming that royal order was eternal. Far beyond their shadows, however, local rulers were gathering influence, old networks were weakening, and communities were learning that a stone mountain could preserve a king's name without preserving his kingdom. The collapse of central authority did not leave Egypt empty, silent, or suddenly without civilization. Along the Nile, farmers still planted grain, craftsmen still shaped wood and stone, priests still maintained local shrines, and officials continued recording property and collecting produce. What disappeared was the certainty that one royal court could command the entire country. In its place rose powerful provincial families whose leaders controlled farmland, labor, soldiers, and river traffic within their own districts. Their rock-cut tombs grew larger, their inscriptions praised their generosity during difficult years, and some claimed that they had fed the hungry when neighboring communities suffered. These statements were designed to glorify the tomb owner, so they cannot be read as neutral reports, but they reveal a profound change in political imagination. Protection and prosperity were no longer presented as gifts flowing only from the king. Local rulers now claimed that they themselves had preserved order when the center could not. Later Egyptian literature remembered this period through images of hunger, violence, and a world turned upside down. Yet the archaeological picture is more complicated than a simple dark age. Some regions may have suffered serious shortages, perhaps worsened by low or irregular Nile floods, while others continued to prosper. Climate stress may have intensified existing weaknesses, but it did not act alone. A difficult flood became politically destructive when the state could no longer move resources effectively, when succession was uncertain, and when provincial officials had enough independence to ignore commands from a distant court. Egypt fractured because several pressures met at the same moment, and once unity broke, no ruler could restore it merely by wearing the double crown. In the north, kings based around Heracleopolis claimed authority over much of the country. Far to the south, Thebes was still a regional city rather than the great religious capital it would later become, but its rulers were ambitious. The early Theban leaders carried the name Intef and gradually expanded their territory northward. Their inscriptions speak of battles, captured towns, secured borders, and loyalty to the Theban house. Intef II appears to have extended his control from the region of Thebes toward Abydos, bringing the southern kingdom into direct conflict with the Heracleopolitan sphere. The struggle was probably not one continuous war. Years of raids, shifting alliances, local feuds, and temporary settlements may have separated the major campaigns. The surviving evidence comes mainly from victorious rulers and officials, so many defeats and compromises have disappeared from the record. What remains visible is a tightening contest along the Nile, with both sides understanding that whoever controlled the river's central stretch could decide Egypt's future. The turning point came under Nefertiti II. Early in his long reign, he was still one southern king among rivals. By its later years, he had defeated the northern regime and claimed rule over the two lands. The exact sequence of his conquest is uncertain, but the political result was unmistakable. Around the 21st century BC, Egypt was reunited under a Theban dynasty. Mentuhotep did more than win a civil conflict. He had to persuade communities exhausted by division that unity could again be trusted. His royal titles changed during his reign, reflecting a growing claim to restored order, and his monuments joined southern traditions with forms associated with the older northern court. At Deir el-Bahri, beneath the cliffs on the western bank of Thebes, he created a mortuary complex unlike the massive stone pyramids of earlier kings. Terraces, pillared spaces, gardens, royal statues, and a tomb cut into the landscape formed a monument that seemed to grow from the cliffs themselves. The design announced that a new age had begun, but it did not simply reject the past. Mentuhotep presented himself as the restorer of an ancient ideal, the king who had brought the country back from fragmentation. That memory became central to Middle Kingdom identity. The experience of collapse could not be erased, so the new state transformed it into a warning. Unity was not natural or permanent. It had to be defended. After the final rulers of the 11th dynasty, power passed to Amenemhat I, founder of the 12th dynasty. His origins are not completely clear, though he may have risen from high office, perhaps serving as vizier before taking the throne. Rather than ruling entirely from Thebes, he established a new royal residence called Ichtawi, somewhere near the entrance to the Fayum and the older political heartland around Memphis. Its precise location has not yet been securely identified, but its strategic purpose is easier to understand. From this region, the court could watch both Upper and Lower Egypt, respond to activity in the eastern delta, and avoid becoming too closely dependent on any single southern power base. Amenemhat's reign appears to have strengthened administration, reorganized royal control, and renewed pyramid building, yet the circumstances of his death remain shadowed by literature. A text known as the Teaching of Amenemhat presents a dead king warning his son not to trust even those closest to him, describing an attack within the palace while his guards were absent. The story of Sinuhe begins with news of the king's death reaching the royal heir during a campaign, causing the main character to flee Egypt in panic. These works may preserve a memory of assassination, but they were crafted literary compositions, not court transcripts. Their deeper importance lies in the anxiety they express. Even a powerful ruler who had rebuilt the state could be vulnerable inside his own residence. Kingship had recovered, but the trauma of disorder remained beneath its surface. Under Senuseret I and his successors, the 12th dynasty developed one of the most stable and productive governments in Egyptian history. Royal building expanded at temples across the country, tying local gods and regional communities more closely to the crown. At Thebes, the cult of Amun grew in importance, and the temple complex at Karnak began its long rise. The king's presence was no longer expressed only through one enormous tomb. It appeared in sanctuaries, statues, inscriptions, estates, and officials distributed along the river. Provincial governors still held considerable status, as the decorated tombs at places such as Beni Hassan demonstrate. Their walls show wrestling, hunting, agriculture, workshops, military groups, and visitors from beyond Egypt, offering unusually rich glimpses of a society connected by trade and movement. Yet the relationship between these governors and the royal court was delicate. Their local knowledge helped the state function, but hereditary regional power could also recreate the divisions the dynasty feared. Successive kings, therefore, worked to bind provincial elites to the crown, sometimes through appointment, reward, marriage, or administrative reorganization, rather than open confrontation. Beyond Egypt's southern frontier, the monarchy pursued a more visible form of control. Nubia was valuable not only for gold, but also for cattle, ivory, stone, exotic products, and access to trade routes reaching deeper into Africa. Egyptian armies campaigned southward, while a chain of massive fortresses rose near the Nile's cataracts. Sites such as Buhen, Semna, and others combined military walls, storage spaces, docks, workshops, and administrative offices. They monitored river movement, protected supply lines, and marked a frontier where trade and coercion existed side by side. Official inscriptions portrayed Nubians through the harsh language of royal domination, but real frontier life must have involved negotiation, exchange, migration, and cultural interaction, as well as conflict. Under Senuseret III, Egyptian military activity in Nubia intensified, and boundary inscriptions announced limits that foreigners were not to cross without permission. These declarations projected total control, though maintaining that control across difficult terrain required constant manpower and resources. The same state also invested closer to home. In the Fayum, a broad depression connected to the Nile through a natural channel, royal projects supported settlement, water management, and expanded cultivation. Older accounts sometimes imagined Middle Kingdom engineers completely draining a great lake, but the actual process was likely more gradual and complex. Dikes, canals, controlled waterways, and new communities helped transform parts of the region into an important agricultural and royal center. Senuseret II built his pyramid at Lahun near the Fayum entrance, where the remains of a planned settlement reveal rows of houses, administrative spaces, tools, papyri, and traces of daily life. Behind the polished image of royal stability stood bakers, brewers, textile workers, scribes, guards, physicians, priests, and laborers whose routines kept the system alive. The Middle Kingdom also produced a remarkable body of literature that explored exile, justice, loyalty, fear, ambition, and the uncertain distance between appearance and truth. In The Story of Sinuhe, an Egyptian official flees abroad, builds a successful life, yet continues longing for return and proper burial in his homeland. The Eloquent Peasant follows a man seeking justice from officials through speeches of extraordinary moral force. Other compositions imagine shipwrecks, royal instruction, political disorder, and conversations with death. These texts should not be treated as direct descriptions of ordinary life, and many survive in copies made after their presumed composition. But they reveal a culture reflecting on power, rather than merely celebrating it. The ideal ruler was still mighty, yet he was increasingly shown as burdened by responsibility, listening to petitions, confronting hidden danger, and holding together a society that knew unity could fail. Beliefs about the afterlife were also changing in visible ways. Sacred formulas, once carved primarily inside royal pyramids, appeared in expanded forms on the coffins and burial chambers of non-royal elites. These coffin texts offered spells for protection, transformation, movement, food, and entry into the divine world. This development is sometimes described as a democratization of the afterlife, but that phrase can exaggerate how widely access had spread. Fine coffins, tombs, rituals, and written spells still required wealth. What had changed was that eternal destiny was no longer expressed as an exclusively royal journey. At Abydos, devotion to Osiris grew, and officials erected memorial stelae near the god's sacred landscape, hoping to participate symbolically in festivals connected with his death and restoration. Osiris offered a powerful promise. What had been broken could be made whole, and death itself could become a passage toward renewed existence. It was a belief perfectly suited to a civilization that had already watched its political world collapse and return. By the reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, royal art began showing kings with heavy-lidded eyes, lined faces, and expressions that seem unusually severe. These portraits may represent age, vigilance, divine power, or a new ideal of kingship rather than realistic fatigue, but their effect is difficult to ignore. The ruler no longer appears untouched by the world he governs. He seems to carry its weight. Senusret III is often associated with reducing the independence of provincial governors, although the process may have been gradual rather than a single reform. Amenemhat III presided over extensive building, mining, and development, but long prosperity placed its own demands on the state. After the 12th dynasty, the throne passed rapidly among numerous kings of the 13th. Administration continued, monuments were still produced, and Egypt did not immediately collapse. Yet, short reigns and uncertain succession weakened the personal authority of kingship. Meanwhile, the Eastern Delta was changing. For generations, people from Western Asia had entered Egypt as traders, workers, soldiers, servants, and settlers. At Avaris, their communities grew within an Egyptian world while preserving connections and customs of their own. There was no single night when a foreign army suddenly appeared and seized an untouched country. Instead, as central power thinned and regional authority strengthened, a new political center slowly emerged in the north. Egypt had rebuilt itself once through force, administration, literature, faith, and the memory of chaos. Now, almost without realizing it, the kingdom was approaching another division, and this time the rulers of the Delta would carry names, weapons, and traditions that later Egyptians would remember with deep unease. Avaris did not become the capital of a foreign dynasty in a single night. Long before the Hyksos ruled the eastern Delta, people from the Levant had been arriving in Egypt as merchants, herders, sailors, craftsmen, soldiers, and laborers, settling beside Egyptian communities and becoming part of the region's economy. Their houses, pottery, burial customs, weapons, and religious practices preserved connections to Western Asia, yet they also adopted Egyptian titles, artistic forms, and ways of governing. This slow blending matters because later Egyptian tradition remembered the Hyksos as brutal outsiders who seized the country by force, while archaeology suggests a more complicated beginning. Political control in the north may have grown gradually as the central government weakened, local rulers became independent, and Avaris developed into a wealthy port connected to trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. The name Hyksos comes from an Egyptian expression meaning rulers of foreign lands, not the name of a single ethnic people. It referred most directly to a line of kings, usually associated with the 15th dynasty, whose authority reached across much of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. They were foreign in origin, but by the time they became kings, their world was already deeply entangled with Egypt. At Avaris, palaces, temples, workshops, harbors, and crowded neighborhoods rose near branches of the Nile. Ships brought timber, wine, oil, metals, and luxury goods from the Levant and perhaps farther across the Mediterranean. The city's rulers used Egyptian royal names, commissioned monuments, and honored Egyptian gods, while also maintaining devotion to deities connected with their ancestral homelands. The storm god Baal was likely associated with Seth, the powerful Egyptian god of deserts, violence, and foreign regions. This was not a simple case of one culture replacing another. It was a hybrid court using whatever traditions could strengthen its authority. Yet, from the viewpoint of Thebes, far to the south, the Hyksos were not neighbors engaged in cultural exchange. They were rival kings occupying part of the two lands. Egypt had split into competing zones. The Hyksos controlled the delta and important routes into Western Asia. The Theban rulers governed southern Egypt. Farther south, the kingdom of Kerma in Nubia had become a major power in its own right, controlling trade and threatening Egyptian positions along the Nile. Thebes stood between two stronger forces, squeezed from the north and south, and for a time its kings may have survived by paying tribute or accepting an uneasy balance. Later propaganda would portray the southern rulers as heroic liberators waiting to strike, but the reality was probably more cautious. Thebes needed time to gather wealth, secure allies, organize troops, and decide whether rebellion was worth the risk. The tension between the two kingdoms survives in a later literary tale about the Hyksos king Apophis and the Theban ruler Sekenenre-Tao. In the story, Apophis complains that hippopotamuses in a pool at Thebes are disturbing his sleep, even though Avaris lies hundreds of miles away. The demand is absurd, designed to humiliate the southern king and provoke a response. The tale cannot be treated as a literal record, but it captures the political atmosphere. A powerful northern ruler testing a subordinate rival, and a Theban court increasingly unwilling to tolerate the insult. Sekenenre-Tao appears to have moved from resistance to open war, and his mummy provides one of the most haunting pieces of evidence from the period. His skull bears several severe wounds caused by different weapons. Modern examinations suggest that he died violently, perhaps in battle, during capture, or in an execution after being restrained. The exact circumstances remain uncertain, but he was not a king who died quietly in bed. His body became the physical cost of the struggle before victory was assured. The war continued under Thutmose, possibly Sekenenre's son or close successor. Thutmose's surviving victory inscriptions present him as a ruler outraged that Egypt was divided between an Asian king in the north and a Nubian ruler in the south. The language is dramatic and self-serving, but his campaigns were real. He moved northward, attacked territories linked to the Hyksos, captured supplies, disrupted communication, and pushed toward Avaris. One inscription describes the interception of a messenger traveling between the Hyksos ruler and the king of Kush, suggesting that Apophis may have sought Nubian support against Thebes. Whether the message is reported exactly or shaped for propaganda, it reveals the strategic nightmare facing Thutmose. If the Hyksos and Kerma coordinated their forces, Thebes could be crushed between them. Thutmose's answer was speed and aggression. He struck north, seized river traffic, and presented himself as the defender of Egypt's rightful order. Yet he did not complete the conquest. His reign was brief, and he disappeared before Avaris fell. The final phase belonged to Ahmose, a younger member of the Theban royal family who came to the throne while still a child or young man. During his early reign, the government was likely stabilized by his mother, Ahotep, whose later honors suggest an unusually important political role. A ceremonial object associated with her praises her for caring for Egypt, bringing back fugitives, calming the south, and suppressing rebellion. The language may be formal, but it hints that the war was not fought only at the northern frontier. The Theban dynasty had to control unrest at home while preparing for a larger campaign. Ahmose eventually resumed the attack, and here the story becomes clearer through the autobiography of a soldier also named Ahmose, son of Ibana. Inscribed in his tomb at El Kab, his account describes service aboard royal ships, fighting around avarice, capturing enemies, receiving gold for bravery, and taking part in later campaigns. His testimony is valuable because it brings the war down from the level of kings to the experience of an individual soldier, though it still follows the conventions of an elite tomb biography and emphasizes his achievements. The battles around Avaris may have involved repeated assaults, river operations, blockades, and control of nearby settlements rather than one decisive clash. The city stood within a watery landscape of channels and marshes, making naval skill essential. Ahmose's forces had to isolate it, cut supply routes, and break the political network that supported Hyksos rule. Eventually, Avaris fell. The exact date and details are uncertain, but by around the middle of the 16th century BC, Hyksos' power in Egypt had been destroyed. Some of their population may have fled, some may have been expelled, and many ordinary residents probably remained and were absorbed into the reunited kingdom. The later image of a complete foreign population driven out at once is almost certainly too simple. Ahmose pursued Hyksos' forces into southern Canaan and besieged a place called Sharuhen, according to the soldier's account, perhaps to prevent the defeated dynasty from regrouping beyond Egypt's border. This pursuit marked a turning point in Egyptian strategy. Earlier kings had often defended the Nile Valley and launched limited expeditions abroad. The experience of Hyksos rule convinced the new Theban dynasty that safety required control beyond Egypt itself. Enemies could no longer be allowed to gather at the edge of the delta. The frontier had to be pushed outward. Ahmose also turned south against Nubian resistance, restoring Egyptian authority in regions that had slipped away during the period of division. The struggle therefore became more than a war of national liberation. It was the beginning of an expansionist state that would soon dominate territory from deep in Nubia to the Levant. The military changes associated with this era helped make that expansion possible. Horses and light chariots became increasingly important in Egypt during or around the Hyksos period, along with new forms of weapons and fortified warfare. Popular accounts often say that the Hyksos introduced all of these technologies to helpless Egyptians, but the evidence is not that clean. Chariots, composite bows, bronze weapons, and new military practices were spreading across Western Asia through broader networks of exchange and conflict. The Hyksos may have accelerated their adoption in Egypt, and the Theban kings clearly learned from the warfare of the age, but no single people invented Egypt's new army overnight. The decisive advantage came from combining technology with organization. Trained troops, river fleets, supply systems, foreign mercenaries, royal workshops, and commanders rewarded directly by the king. Victory also had to be turned into memory. Ahmose founded the 18th dynasty and became the first ruler of what modern historians call the New Kingdom. Temples were restored, royal estates reorganized, and monuments presented the Theban gods as partners in the triumph. Amun, whose cult had grown in Thebes, rose rapidly in prestige and wealth. The royal family honored the women who had preserved the dynasty through years of uncertainty, including Ahotep and Ahmose Nefertari, who became one of the most influential queens of the early New Kingdom and was later worshipped at Thebes. The story the new regime told was clear. Egypt had fallen under foreign domination, the gods had chosen the Theban house, and the rightful king had restored Ma'at. That story contained truth, but it also simplified decades of migration, coexistence, regional politics, and cultural exchange into a powerful national drama. The Hyksos were remembered less as people who had lived within Egypt than as a warning about what happened when the country became divided. Their defeat shaped Egyptian policy for generations. Future pharaohs would campaign farther into Asia, fortify Nubia, collect tribute, and present conquest as prevention. The fear of another Avaris helped create an empire. As the smoke of war faded, Egypt was richer in military knowledge, more suspicious of its borders, and more determined to control the lands beyond them. The kings who followed Ahmose would not be satisfied with merely recovering what had been lost. They would transform a reunited kingdom into the most powerful Egyptian state the ancient world had yet seen. Victory had changed Egypt's borders, but it had also changed the way its kings thought. The rulers of the early 18th dynasty no longer believed that safety ended at the edges of the Nile Valley. Wealth, information, and military pressure now had to move outward, into Nubia and across the Sinai, toward the cities of the Levant, where shifting alliances could either protect Egypt or threaten it. Under Amenhotep I, the government consolidated what had been won, restored temples, strengthened royal institutions, and developed a new approach to royal burial in the cliffs west of Thebes. The old pyramid had been both tomb and landmark, visible for miles. But visibility also attracted thieves. New kingdom rulers increasingly separated the hidden burial chamber from the mortuary temple where public rituals were performed. Their bodies could be concealed in remote valleys, while their names, statues, and offerings remained accessible to priests and worshippers. Somewhere during this early period, a specialized community of craftsmen began serving the royal tomb projects on the western bank of Thebes. Their later village, known today as Deir el-Medina, would preserve an unusually intimate record of ancient working life. Draftsmen, stonecutters, painters, scribes, carpenters, wives, children, disputes, prayers, debts, jokes, and absences from work. The empire's most private monuments were not created by anonymous hands. They were made by families who lived within walking distance of the graves they carved. Under Thutmose I, Egyptian armies pushed farther than before. In Nubia, royal power advanced southward, securing access to gold and trade routes while imposing Egyptian administration on conquered territories. To the northeast, the king campaigned deep into Syria and claimed to have reached the Euphrates. Such inscriptions always magnified royal success, and control at that distance was rarely permanent, but the direction was clear. Egypt had entered the political world of Western Asia not as a merchant on the edge of events, but as a military power. Gold from Nubia, tribute from subject rulers, captives, cattle, timber, precious metals, luxury goods, and foreign craftsmanship began flowing toward the court and the temples. This wealth did not simply disappear into palace storerooms. It was transformed into colossal gateways, obelisks, statues, ceremonial vessels, estates, and gifts to the gods, especially Amun of Thebes. Every successful campaign strengthened the king, but it also strengthened Amun's priesthood, because victory was presented as evidence that the god had marched with the army. The relationship benefited both sides, though it quietly created an institution whose wealth would one day rival the crown itself. After the brief reign of Thutmose II, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III. Because the new king was still a child, Hatshepsut, his father's chief royal wife, and his own aunt and stepmother, initially governed as regent. Then, somewhere within the first several years of the joint reign, she crossed a boundary few Egyptian royal women had crossed. She adopted the full titles and ceremonial identity of a king. Hatshepsut did not remove Thutmose III from the throne. Their names continued to appear together, and official dates were counted from the beginning of his reign. Yet she became the dominant ruler, shown making offerings to the gods, defeating symbolic enemies, and wearing the crowns associated with kingship. Artists represented her in several ways. Some statues preserved feminine features and grammatical forms. Others gave her the conventional body, kilt, and false beard of a male pharaoh. This was not necessarily an attempt to pretend that she was biologically male. Egyptian royal imagery followed a visual language older than any individual ruler. To act as king, Hatshepsut had to occupy the king's place inside that language. She reinforced her legitimacy by emphasizing her royal blood, her relationship with Amun, and a divine birth tradition in which the god was said to have chosen her before she was born. Whether these claims persuaded everyone cannot be known, but they were carefully designed for a society in which political authority and sacred order could not easily be separated. Her reign lasted nearly 2 decades and was marked by extensive building throughout Egypt, most famously her terraced mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, where colonnades and ramps appear to rise toward the cliffs behind them. On the walls of that temple, Hatshepsut recorded an expedition to the land of Punt. Egyptian ships sailed south through the Red Sea and returned with incense, ebony, ivory, animal skins, gold, exotic creatures, and living myrrh trees whose roots were transported in baskets. Punt was a real trading region, but its exact location remains debated, with many scholars placing it somewhere around the southern Red Sea, possibly including parts of modern Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, or nearby areas. The reliefs present the voyage as a peaceful exchange welcomed by Punt's rulers, though, like all royal scenes, they were arranged to celebrate Egyptian success. What made the expedition politically valuable was not only the cargo. Incense was essential to temple ritual, and by bringing rare materials directly to Amun, Hatshepsut could frame long-distance trade as proof that the world itself recognized her kingship. Peace, however, should not be mistaken for weakness. Hatshepsut maintained Egypt's influence abroad and likely inherited an experienced army. Thutmose III, meanwhile, did not spend his youth imprisoned or removed from public life, as older dramatic retellings sometimes suggested. He was recognized as king and appears to have received military and administrative experience during the joint reign. When Hatshepsut died, he began ruling alone, and the scale of his campaigns soon transformed Egypt's empire. In his first major independent expedition, a coalition centered on Kadesh and Megiddo challenged Egyptian authority in Canaan. The records carved at Karnak describe Thutmose's commanders warning him against a narrow and dangerous route through the hills toward Megiddo. The king chose that route anyway, perhaps because surprise mattered more than safety. The account may heighten his personal courage, but the strategic risk was real. The Egyptian army emerged near Megiddo before the coalition was fully prepared, won the field, and drove its enemies behind the city walls. According to the royal narrative, Egyptian troops paused to collect abandoned equipment and possessions rather than immediately sealing the escape routes, allowing many defenders to reach safety. It is an unusually human detail inside a triumphal record. Victory nearly became incomplete because soldiers behaved like soldiers. Megiddo was then besieged until its rulers submitted. The campaign did not create permanent peace. Thutmose III returned to Western Asia repeatedly. At least 17 campaigns are traditionally counted, striking rebellious cities, collecting tribute, taking hostages, securing ports, and eventually reaching the Euphrates. Yet Egypt's empire was not a single block of territory governed everywhere in the same way. Nubia came under tighter Egyptian administration, with fortresses, temples, officials, and a viceroy representing the crown. In the Levant, control was often more flexible. Local rulers remained in their cities as long as they paid tribute, supplied troops or goods, and avoided rebellion. Their sons might be taken to Egypt, educated at court, and later returned as rulers who understood Egyptian customs and owed their position to the pharaoh. Garrisons and administrators occupied strategic locations, but much of the system depended on personal loyalty, fear, rewards, and the calculation that cooperation was safer than resistance. That made the empire powerful, but never effortless. When one king died, distant rulers might test his successor. When another great power offered support, alliances could shift quickly. The wall scenes showing lines of foreigners carrying gold, animals, vessels, weapons, and rare materials were not simple pictures of endless submission. They were the idealized surface of a political system requiring constant attention. Thutmose III's successors maintained much of what he had built. Amenhotep II's inscriptions emphasized his athletic strength, archery, speed, and dominance in battle, presenting the king's physical body as a weapon of the state. Behind the heroic exaggeration, campaigns in Western Asia revealed the continuing need to enforce Egyptian authority. Thutmose IV also inherited an international world in which diplomacy mattered as much as war. His famous dream stela, placed between the paws of the Great Sphinx, tells how the young prince rested near the sand-covered monument and dreamed that the god promised him kingship if he cleared away the sand. The story may preserve a real restoration project, but it also solved a political problem. It presented Thutmose's accession not merely as family succession, but as a choice made by a god. By the time Amenhotep III came to the throne, Egypt stood at the height of its wealth. His reign lasted nearly 4 decades and produced building on an immense scale. At Thebes, he expanded temples, developed the palace complex at Malkata, built a vast mortuary temple, and erected the colossal seated statues later called the Colossi of Memnon. Queen T appeared beside him with unusual prominence, suggesting a royal partnership more visible than that of many earlier queens. The surviving diplomatic correspondence associated with this age shows Egyptian messengers moving between the courts of Babylon, Mitanni, Assyria, Hatti, Cyprus, and other kingdoms. Great kings addressed one another as brothers, exchanged luxury gifts, negotiated marriages, complained about missing gold, and argued over status with a politeness that often barely concealed frustration. Egypt received foreign princesses, though Egyptian royal daughters were apparently not sent abroad in return, a refusal that expressed the court's belief in its own superior position. Gold gave Egypt special influence. To rulers beyond the Nile, it seemed so plentiful that they repeatedly asked for more, but gifts were never free. A shipment of gold might secure loyalty, balance a marriage agreement, or remind another king that friendship with Egypt had material rewards. Amenhotep III's reign was therefore not a peaceful pause after conquest. It was the moment when military achievement had matured into international prestige. Inside Egypt, the abundance was dazzling, but uneven. Temples received land, labor, cattle, workshops, captives, and treasure. Officials built richly decorated tombs showing banquets, gardens, tribute processions, and orderly estates. Craftsmen produced glass, faience, jewelry, furniture, chariots, painted coffins, and stone vessels of extraordinary refinement. The court projected confidence so complete that Amenhotep III increasingly associated himself with solar divinity during his own lifetime. Festivals renewed his power, colossal statues multiplied his presence, and the king appeared less like a distant servant of the gods than a divine force standing among them. Yet the magnificence contained a quiet tension. Amun's establishment had grown enormously through generations of royal gifts, while solar theology was also becoming more prominent at court. The sun could be understood through several divine forms, but one manifestation, the visible disk called the Aten, was receiving increasing attention. When Amenhotep III died, he left his heir an empire rich in gold, protected by diplomacy, supported by temples, and feared beyond its borders. It looked stronger than Egypt had ever been. The new king was named Amenhotep IV, a name honoring Amun. Within a few years, he would reject that name, abandon the traditional capital, build a new city in the desert, and force Egypt to confront a question no pharaoh before him had pushed so far. What would happen if the king tried to change the gods themselves? Amenhotep IV inherited a kingdom that looked almost unshakable. Yet within only a few years, he began dismantling the religious balance that had supported Egyptian kingship for generations. At first, the change did not appear to be a complete break. The Aten, represented as the visible disk of the sun, had already received royal attention before his reign, and solar theology had long been part of Egyptian belief. But the new king pushed that devotion further. He built temples to the Aten at Karnak and placed the royal family at the center of worship. In traditional temple scenes, a king stood before many gods hidden within dark sanctuaries. In the new imagery, the Aten appeared openly above the royal family, its rays ending in tiny hands that offered life to the king and queen. The message grew increasingly radical. Divine power flowed through the sun, but ordinary people reached that power most directly through the ruler and his household. Around the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, usually understood as effective for the Aten, and announced the creation of a new royal city in a stretch of desert he described as belonging to no previous god or ruler. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. Boundary stela carved into the surrounding cliffs marked the city and presented its foundation as a divine command. In practical terms, the move pulled the royal court away from Thebes, where the priesthood and estates of Amun had accumulated immense influence. Whether Akhenaten's central aim was religious conviction, political control, or both, cannot be proven. The most convincing explanation may be that such motives were inseparable. In Egypt, controlling access to the gods also meant controlling wealth, legitimacy, land, labor, and the stories by which power justified itself. Akhenaten rose with astonishing speed. Palaces, houses, workshops, temples, and broad ceremonial roads spread across the desert plain. The main Aten temples opened to the sky, turning sunlight and royal processions into the center of worship. Yet behind its painted palaces lived laborers, servants, officials, soldiers, artists, priests, and families coping with heat, shortages, disease, and the demands of rapid construction. Human remains from cemeteries around Amarna show signs of hard labor and nutritional stress among parts of the population, reminding us that even a religious revolution was built by bodies that paid a price. At the center of the new order stood Nefertiti. Her importance went far beyond beauty. In reliefs and statues, she appears beside Akhenaten with a prominence rare even for a great royal wife. She offers to the Aten, drives a chariot, rewards officials, and in some scenes strikes Egypt's enemies in a pose traditionally reserved for kings. The famous painted bust found at Amarna made her face recognizable, but it can hide how politically unusual she was. The Aten's rays often reached both king and queen, while their daughters stood beneath them, creating an image of divine power contained within the royal family. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shown touching their children, sitting together beneath the sun, and mourning a daughter's death. The scenes feel personal, but they were still carefully constructed royal images. Their tenderness served theology as well as emotion. The royal household became a living model of creation and life beneath the Aten. The bodies of Akhenaten and his family were also rendered in a new style, with long faces, rounded stomachs, wide hips, and elongated limbs. These features have inspired theories about illness or genetic disorders, but no diagnosis can be established from artistic convention alone. The style may have expressed transformation, divine difference, a rejection of older ideals, or a combination of symbolic and individual features. The court wanted to look different, making the revolution visible in every face, gesture, and carved surface. Over time, the change became more severe. The name and images of Amun were attacked in many places, and references to gods in the plural could also be removed. Temples dedicated to traditional deities lost royal support, though the extent to which private worship was suppressed remains uncertain. People did not simply forget the gods their families had honored for centuries. Small objects and domestic evidence suggest that older religious habits continued, at least in private. This is why describing Akhenaten as the founder of the world's first pure monotheism can be misleading. Atenism elevated one divine force above all others and marginalized competing gods at the state level, but it remained centered on the king and did not necessarily replace the beliefs of the wider population. It may be more accurate to call it a radical royal cult or an exclusive state religion, though no single label captures every stage of its development. While the court celebrated sunlight and renewal at Akhenaten, Egypt's international system was becoming less secure. Clay tablets discovered in the city, known as the Amarna letters, preserve correspondence between Egypt and rulers across Western Asia. Great kings exchanged gifts and marriage proposals, while smaller rulers in Canaan pleaded for troops, accused neighbors of betrayal, and warned that cities were slipping from Egyptian control. These letters have often been used to portray Akhenaten as a dreamer who ignored the empire. But the evidence is not so simple. Some requests may have been exaggerated, rival rulers manipulated information, and diplomatic archives rarely preserve every response. Egypt still intervened in some regions, yet its authority was clearly under pressure as Hittite power expanded and local alliances shifted. Akhenaten's concentration on the Aten may have weakened traditional institutions, but geopolitical change was larger than one man. Then, the royal family itself began to disappear. Several of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters died or vanished from the record. Nefertiti's later fate remains one of the period's greatest puzzles. She may have died before Akhenaten, continued as queen under another name, or even ruled as a pharaoh called Neferuaten. Another shadowy figure, Smenkhkare, appears briefly near the end of the reign or immediately afterward, but the exact relationship among these individuals remains debated. Damaged inscriptions, reused monuments, altered names, and short reigns have left a succession so tangled that each new discovery can shift the argument. What is clear is that Akhenaten died after roughly 17 years on the throne, and his religious system began to unravel almost immediately. The next securely known young king was born Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten. He was probably around 8 or 9 years old when he came to the throne. His precise parentage has not been settled beyond dispute, though he was almost certainly a close member of the Amarna royal family and possibly a son of Akhenaten. He married Ankhesenpaten, one of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters. A child king could not reverse a national religious experiment alone. Senior officials, priests, military commanders, and courtiers guided the new reign, among them Ai and Horemheb, both of whom would later become kings. The restoration unfolded quickly. Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, while his queen became Ankhesenamun. The court moved away from Akhenaten, temples of the traditional gods reopened, damaged cult images were repaired, and resources returned to priesthoods that had lost royal support. A restoration inscription issued in the young king's name described temples in ruin, sanctuaries abandoned, and the gods turning away from Egypt. This language was political, shaped to condemn the previous reign and legitimize the new order, but it reveals how thoroughly Akhenaten's experiment was being rejected. Tutankhamun ruled for only about a decade and died around the age of 19. His body has been examined repeatedly, producing theories involving injury, malaria, inherited health problems, infection, or a combination of conditions. No single cause has achieved universal agreement, and dramatic claims of murder are not supported strongly enough to be treated as fact. His death created an immediate crisis because no surviving child was ready to inherit. A Hittite record describes an Egyptian queen who wrote to the Hittite king saying that her husband had died and asking him to send one of his sons for her to marry. Many scholars identify her as Akhenaten, though certainty remains impossible. The prince sent to Egypt was killed before reaching the throne, deepening hostility between the two powers. I soon became king, followed by Horemheb, a military commander who presented himself as the restorer of order. Under Horemheb, the names of Akhenaten, his immediate successors, and even Tutankhamun were omitted from official king lists, while their monuments were dismantled and reused. The state attempted to compress the entire Amarna episode into silence. Ironically, that erasure helped preserve the young king the world would later remember. Tutankhamun's tomb was small, hurriedly prepared, and eventually buried beneath debris from later construction. Robbers entered it in antiquity but did not empty it completely, and its location faded from memory. More than 3,000 years after his funeral, the sealed chambers would reveal gold, chariots, furniture, weapons, clothing, food, and the famous mask placed over his body. The boy who achieved little in life became the most recognizable pharaoh in death, while Akhenaten, who had tried to remake eternity around his own vision, saw his city abandoned, his temples broken apart, and his name condemned. Yet Egypt could not simply return to the world that existed before him. The next dynasty would carry the memory of religious upheaval, uncertain succession, and weakening influence abroad, and its kings would answer with military ambition, colossal monuments, and some of the most determined royal propaganda the ancient world had ever seen. Horemheb left no surviving son to inherit the throne, so the future of Egypt passed to a trusted military officer named Ramesses II, a man who had risen through the army and administration rather than being born into the old royal family. When he became king, he took the name Ramesses I and founded the 19th dynasty. But his reign was brief, lasting little more than a year. The real work of the new house fell to his son Seti I, who understood that Egypt's empire could not be restored by declarations alone. In the north, Hittite influence had spread across Syria, and cities that once paid tribute to Egypt now balanced between rival great powers. Seti campaigned through Canaan and into Syria, temporarily recovered important positions, and filled the walls of Karnak with scenes of the king crushing enemies beneath his chariot. Those images followed an ancient language of victory, but behind them stood a harder reality. Egyptian authority in Western Asia had become expensive to maintain and impossible to take for granted. Seti also rebuilt temples damaged or neglected during the Amarna period and created one of Egypt's most elegant royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. At Abydos, his temple honored a long sequence of earlier kings, while carefully excluding rulers associated with Akhenaten's revolution, turning history itself into an act of political repair. His son, Ramesses II, inherited that repaired image of kingship and enlarged it until his name seemed to cover Egypt. He came to the throne around 1279 BC, probably still a young man, and would rule for roughly 66 years, long enough for most living Egyptians to know no other pharaoh. He built on a scale so vast that later generations sometimes mistook older monuments for his, simply because his name had been carved upon them. Ramses completed projects begun by Seti, raised new temples from Nubia to the Delta, enlarged existing sanctuaries, commissioned colossal statues, and established a royal residence in the eastern Delta called Ramses. Positioned near the routes leading into Asia, the city combined palace, harbor, military base, workshops, temples, stables, and international trade. From there, Egypt could watch the frontier and prepare armies without moving them from distant Thebes. It was the ideal capital for a king who wanted to appear constantly ready for war. The greatest test came early in his reign at Kadesh, a fortified city near the Orontes River in what is now Syria. Ramesses marched north with an army divided into several large units named for Egyptian gods. He believed the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, was farther away, but two captured scouts revealed that the main Hittite force was actually hidden nearby. By then, Ramesses and the division of Amun had moved ahead, while much of the Egyptian army remained stretched along the road. The Hittites launched a chariot attack across the river and struck the unprepared division of Ra, scattering troops and driving the chaos toward the Egyptian camp. The battle that followed became the central drama of Ramses' royal image. In the Egyptian version, abandoned by frightened soldiers and surrounded by enemies, the king called upon Amun, seized his weapons, and charged almost alone into the Hittite force until divine favor turned disaster into victory. The account was repeated in words and images at several temples, allowing Egyptians hundreds of miles from Kadesh to see their pharaoh firing arrows from a racing chariot while enemy soldiers collapsed into the river. Yet the battle was neither the effortless triumph the monuments claimed, nor necessarily the crushing Egyptian defeat sometimes imagined in reaction to that propaganda. Ramesses survived a serious tactical crisis, his army regrouped, and the Hittites failed to destroy the Egyptian force. At the same time, Egypt did not capture Kadesh, and Hittite control in northern Syria remained largely intact. The outcome was probably best understood as indecisive. Both sides could claim that they had avoided defeat, while neither achieved the decisive victory it wanted. What makes Kadesh remarkable is not only the scale of its chariot warfare, but the way Ramesses transformed a dangerous, near disaster into one of history's most enduring stories of personal heroism. He understood that political victory could be created after the battlefield, carved into stone where no enemy account was present to contradict it. Hostilities continued in the following years, but the wider world was changing. Hittite rulers faced pressures from Assyria and internal succession problems, while Egypt had little to gain from endlessly contesting the same Syrian cities. Eventually, Ramesses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III agreed to a formal peace treaty. Versions survive in both Egyptian and Hittite diplomatic traditions, each presenting the agreement in terms favorable to its own ruler. The treaty promised peace, mutual assistance, and the return of fugitives, establishing a political partnership where war had failed to produce a permanent settlement. Ramesses later married a Hittite princess, giving the former enemies a dynastic bond. This was not a romantic union between equal individuals in the modern sense. It was diplomacy expressed through a royal household. Still, the marriage revealed something the battle reliefs concealed. Egypt's greatest king could secure stability not only by defeating rivals, but by recognizing when cooperation served him better. With the northern frontier calmer, Ramesses turned royal wealth into architecture. At Abu Simbel in Nubia, 4 colossal seated images of the king guarded the entrance to a rock-cut temple whose interior celebrated both the gods and Ramesses himself. Nearby stood a smaller temple associated with Queen Nefertari, one of the most prominent women of the reign. At Thebes, the Ramesseum became the center of his mortuary cult, while at Luxor, Karnak, Abydos, Memphis, and countless other sites, his cartouches appeared across gateways, statues, columns, and reliefs. Some monuments were genuinely his creations. Others were completed, altered, or reinscribed under his authority. Applying his name to an older statue was not always simple theft as modern observers understand it. Egyptian kings regularly restored and reused sacred objects, But Ramesses practiced this on such a scale that his presence overwhelms the surviving landscape. His long reign allowed his family to become enormous. He had several principal queens, many additional wives, and perhaps more than 100 sons and daughters, though ancient lists and titles do not always allow an exact count. His children appeared in processions on temple walls, forming a visible dynasty that seemed secure beyond question. Yet longevity created its own danger. Many crown princes died before their father, and when Ramesses finally died in old age, the throne passed to Merneptah, a son who was probably already in his 60s. Egypt remained powerful, but the world beyond it had entered a period of violent disruption. Trade networks that had linked Egypt, Anatolia, Greece, Cyprus, Syria, and the Levant began to fracture near the end of the Late Bronze Age. Cities burned, kingdoms collapsed, populations moved, and the Hittite Empire disappeared. No single cause explains this transformation. Drought, food shortages, internal rebellion, warfare, migration, earthquakes, and the breakdown of trade may have reinforced one another. Merneptah faced an invasion from the west, involving Libyans and allied groups later included among the so-called Sea Peoples. He defeated them and recorded the victory in royal inscriptions, including a famous stela that also contains the earliest widely accepted Egyptian reference to a people called Israel in Canaan. Yet success on one battlefield could not restore the older international system. After Merneptah, the 19th dynasty fell into disputed succession, short reigns, and rivalry within the court. At one point, a powerful official named Bey gained extraordinary influence, while Queen Tusret eventually ruled as king before the dynasty ended in further turmoil. A new line emerged under Setnakta, founder of the 20th dynasty, but its most important ruler was his son, Ramesses III, who consciously presented himself as a successor to Ramesses II. His temple at Medinet Habu echoed his desire to be remembered as a great king II. His temple at Medinet Habu echoed earlier royal architecture, and his battle scenes revived the image of the invincible warrior king. The threats he faced, however, were not merely ceremonial. Libyan groups attacked from the west, while coalitions described in Egyptian texts as coming from islands or lands of the sea moved through the eastern Mediterranean. Some are shown traveling with women, children, carts, ships, and possessions, suggesting that at least part of the movement involved migrating communities rather than a single organized invading army. Their precise origins, identities, and role in the wider collapse remain debated because much of the surviving narrative comes from Egypt's own monuments. Ramesses III claimed to have defeated them in battles on land and water, using archers along the Nile's edges, while Egyptian ships closed against the opposing fleet. Egypt survived, unlike several neighboring powers, but survival came at enormous cost. Campaigns consumed grain, metal, ships, labor, and money. Foreign territories and trade connections became harder to hold, while great temples accumulated land and resources that were increasingly difficult for the palace to control. The contradiction appeared sharply at Deir el-Medina, where the skilled workers responsible for cutting and decorating royal tombs depended on regular deliveries of grain as wages. During the reign of Ramesses III, those deliveries fell behind. The workers stopped working, left their village, and gathered near temple institutions to demand the food owed to them. Their protest is often called the first recorded labor strike in history. The men were not attempting to overthrow the king. They repeatedly described hunger and asked the system to fulfill its obligations. That made the event more revealing. The royal state could still cover temple walls with scenes of endless abundance, yet it struggled to feed the very workers building the king's path to eternity. Ramesses III's reign ended amid a conspiracy within the palace. Judicial records describe members of the royal household and officials plotting to replace the chosen heir, and modern examination of the king's mummy indicates that he suffered a fatal wound to the throat, strongly suggesting the conspiracy reached him. The plot failed to place its preferred prince securely on the throne, but the death exposed how vulnerable kingship had become inside its own walls. The rulers who followed all took the name Ramses, as though repeating the name might preserve the power attached to it, but their reigns brought shrinking influence, economic strain, corruption, and growing insecurity. Tomb robbers entered royal and elite burials, sometimes with the cooperation of officials expected to guard them. Investigations preserved on papyri record accusations, testimony, beatings, confessions, and bureaucratic conflict, revealing a state that could document its failures more easily than prevent them. In Upper Egypt, the high priests of Amun commanded immense estates and political authority, while in the Delta, military and administrative leaders exercised power increasingly independent of Thebes. By the time of Ramesses XI, the last ruler of the New Kingdom, Egypt was again divided in practice. The king's name remained on official documents, but control was shared and contested between northern rulers and the Theban priesthood. The empire created by the early 18th dynasty had faded from Western Asia. Nubia was slipping away, and the royal tomb workers' community would eventually be abandoned. The new kingdom did not end with one final invasion or a single palace collapsing in flames. It weakened through accumulated pressures, costly warfare, disrupted trade, succession conflicts, institutional rivalry, unpaid labor, local ambition, and the widening gap between royal imagery and political reality. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramesses III still stands impossibly large, enemies falling beneath him while the gods guarantee eternal victory. Beyond those walls, Egypt was entering another age of division, and the next pharaohs to claim the country would come not only from old Egyptian centers, but from Libyan families, Nubian kingdoms, and foreign empires watching the Nile from beyond its borders. Egypt did not wake one morning to discover that the age of empire was over. The change happened more quietly, as authority drained away from the throne and settled into the hands of priests, generals, regional governors, and powerful families who controlled their own cities. After the death of Ramesses XI, rulers based at Tanis governed much of the north, while the high priests of Amun exercised enormous influence around Thebes. Both sides continued to honor the idea of a united Egypt, and their families were linked through marriage, but the country no longer obeyed one unquestioned center. This was not an age without culture or government. Temples still received offerings, workshops still produced elaborate coffins and metal statues, and scribes continued to maintain the rituals of an ancient state. Yet beneath that continuity, Egypt was fragmenting into smaller political worlds. The office known as the God's Wife of Amun became especially important at Thebes, where royal women could control estates, participate in major ceremonies, and provide a peaceful way for new dynasties to establish authority in the south. Power was no longer held only by the man wearing the double crown. It moved through temples, families, sacred offices, and alliances that could survive even when kings changed. During the 10th century BC, a new line of rulers emerged from families of Libyan origin, whose ancestors had settled in Egypt generations earlier, often serving in the military. Shoshank I founded the 22nd dynasty and briefly brought much of the country under firmer control. He campaigned into the Levant and recorded a list of conquered or threatened places at Karnak, though the exact relationship between his inscription and the campaign described in biblical tradition remains debated. His success did not create lasting unity. Over time, branches of the royal family established themselves in different cities. Local commanders adopted royal titles, and Egypt entered an increasingly confusing period in which several kings could claim legitimacy at once. Modern historians divide these rulers into dynasties for convenience, but people living along the Nile may have experienced authority in more immediate terms. Which city controlled the river nearby? Which temple owned the fields? Which commander could protect trade? And whose officials arrived to collect resources? By the 8th century BC, the delta contained competing centers at Tanis, Bubastis, Leontopolis, and Sais, while southern Egypt remained tied closely to Amun's temple at Thebes. The old image of the two lands had survived in ritual, but politically, Egypt had become many lands. Far to the south, another kingdom had been growing stronger. Centered first around Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, the kingdom of Kush developed within a region that had once been conquered and administered by New Kingdom Egypt. Kush was not simply an Egyptian colony that somehow continued after Egypt withdrew. Its people formed their own powerful state, combining local Nubian traditions with cultural forms shaped through centuries of contact with Egypt. Kushite rulers built temples, used hieroglyphs, worshipped Amun, and understood themselves as legitimate participants in the sacred world of Egyptian kingship. When northern Egyptian rulers attempted to expand their influence into Upper Egypt, the Kushite king Pi saw a threat moving toward his northern frontier. Around 730 BC, he led an army northward, defeated a coalition of Egyptian rulers, and received their submission at Memphis. His victory stela describes the campaign as a sacred mission commanded by Amun, presenting Pi not as a foreign destroyer, but as a purifier, restoring proper order to a country whose rulers had become divided and impious. Like every royal victory account, the text arranges events to glorify its king, yet the political achievement was real. A ruler from Kush had become the dominant power in Egypt. Pi may have returned south after his campaign rather than ruling continuously from an Egyptian capital, but his successors established the 25th dynasty more firmly over the two lands. They governed as pharaohs, adopted traditional Egyptian royal imagery, supported temples, and expanded the authority of the god's wife of Amun, while also displaying elements of their Nubian identity. Their rule shows why the phrase foreign occupation can conceal more than it explains. The Kushite kings did not stand outside Egyptian culture looking in. They believed they were preserving its sacred traditions, even as they reshaped them through the experience of their own kingdom. Shabaka strengthened Kushite rule in the north, while Taharqa became the dynasty's most famous builder and warrior. Temples, gateways, columns, and statues from his reign appeared across Egypt and Nubia, signaling a revival of monumental kingship. Artists looked deliberately toward older periods for inspiration, producing images that recalled the strength and restraint of the distant past. This was not simple imitation. By choosing ancient styles, the Kushite pharaohs argued that they represented continuity in a fragmented world. But beyond Egypt's northeastern frontier, a new danger was rising. The Neo-Assyrian Empire had become the dominant military power of Western Asia, armed with experienced armies, siege technology, and a system capable of moving forces across enormous distances. Egypt supported opponents of Assyria in the Levant, perhaps hoping to preserve a protective zone between the Nile Delta and the Assyrian frontier. That strategy drew the two powers into direct confrontation. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt, captured Memphis, and forced Taharqa to retreat south. Assyrian control was not immediately secure, and Taharqa returned after the main army withdrew, but another invasion followed. His successor, Tantamani, attempted to restore Kushite power, only to face a devastating Assyrian response. Thebes was attacked and plundered in 663 BC, an event that shocked the region but did not erase the city or end Egyptian religion. Kushite rule withdrew southward, where the kingdom continued for centuries, first around Napata and later around Meroe. The 25th dynasty had ended in Egypt, but Kush did not vanish simply because Egyptian-centered histories stopped following it. The Assyrians had conquered Egypt, yet they did not intend to govern every village directly. They relied on local rulers, including the family based at Saite in the western delta. Psamtik I gradually used that position to reunify the country and free it from effective Assyrian control, beginning the 26th, or Saite dynasty. For the first time in generations, a strong line of kings again ruled nearly all of Egypt from one center. The Saite period is often described as a final renaissance because its artists and rulers consciously revived forms from the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Statues adopted archaic poses, inscriptions recalled ancient language, and kings repaired temples linked to Egypt's deepest past. Yet this revival did not mean Egypt had turned away from the wider world. Psamtik and his successors employed Greek and Carian mercenaries, expanded Mediterranean trade, and maintained relationships with Levantine cities. At Naucratis in the Delta, Mediterranean merchants created an important trading settlement with harbors, sanctuaries, workshops, and connections reaching across the sea. Egypt was looking backward for political legitimacy while becoming more entangled than ever with foreign soldiers and international commerce. Necho II attempted to restore Egyptian influence in the Levant after Assyria's collapse, but the new Babylonian Empire defeated his forces at Carchemish. A later account credited an expedition under Necho with sailing around Africa, though historians continue to debate the details and reliability of that story. His successors balanced military ambition with the difficulty of surviving between larger empires. Apries lost support after a failed campaign connected with Libya, and Amasis took the throne following rebellion within the army. Amasis cultivated close trade relations with Greek communities, while presenting himself through fully Egyptian royal tradition. Under his reign, prosperity and international exchange expanded, but a far greater imperial force was approaching from the east. In 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II defeated the forces of Psamtik III and incorporated Egypt into the Achaemenid Empire. Later Greek writers portrayed Cambyses as a cruel and irrational enemy of Egyptian religion, but these accounts were shaped by hostility toward Persia and cannot be accepted without caution. Persian rulers adopted Egyptian royal titles, appeared as pharaohs on monuments, and used existing administrative structures, though their government also redirected taxes and resources into a much larger imperial system. Some Egyptians cooperated and prospered under Persian rule. Others resisted it. Both realities could exist at the same time. Egypt was no longer the center of its political universe, but it remained wealthy enough that controlling it was worth repeated campaigns. Rebellions eventually weakened Persian control, and in the early 4th century BC, Egypt regained independence under native dynasties. The final independent rulers invested heavily in temple construction, perhaps recognizing that sacred patronage could unite a country whose political security remained fragile. Nectanebo I and his successors built at sites throughout Egypt, leaving monuments that later visitors sometimes mistake for creations of much earlier ages. Nectanebo II became the last native ruler to govern all of ancient Egypt independently. He successfully resisted an early Persian attempt to reconquer the country, but in 343 BC, Artaxerxes III returned with a stronger invasion. Nectanebo was defeated and fled south, though later traditions disagreed about his final destination. Persian rule was restored, and ancient sources describe harsh repression and temple plundering. But those reports are not impartial and should be treated carefully. Even during this second occupation, some Egyptians supported Persian government, while others rebelled against it. Then, in 332 BC, news moved through the Nile Delta that a young Macedonian king had destroyed Persian armies in Asia and was approaching Egypt. Persian authority collapsed with little recorded resistance. The newcomer entered Memphis, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and allowed himself to be recognized through the language of pharaonic kingship. To some Egyptians, he may have appeared as a liberator. To others, he was simply the latest foreign ruler claiming an ancient crown. His name was Alexander, and although he would remain in Egypt only briefly, his arrival opened the final great chapter of pharaonic history, a world in which Greek kings would rule from a new city beside the Mediterranean, Egyptian priests would continue ceremonies older than the pyramids, and one remarkable queen would eventually gamble the survival of her kingdom against the rising power of Rome. Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BC, not as a destroyer, but as a conqueror clever enough to understand that ancient kingdoms were easier to rule when their gods were treated with respect. Persian authority collapsed with little recorded resistance, and the young Macedonian king was welcomed by many Egyptians as a liberator from foreign rule, though he was still another outsider claiming the throne of the Pharaohs. At Memphis, he made offerings, participated in ceremonies, and accepted titles that placed him inside a royal tradition already nearly 3,000 years old. He then traveled west across the desert to the Oracle of Amun at Siwa, where later stories claimed that he was recognized as the son of a god. Exactly what the priests told him is uncertain, but the journey strengthened the image he wanted to project. Alexander was not merely a military ruler standing above Egypt. He had been accepted by the sacred order of the land. Near the Mediterranean coast, he selected the site for a new city. Alexandria faced the sea rather than the deep Nile Valley, and that orientation revealed the future. Egypt would remain rooted in its ancient river civilization, but its political center was now being drawn toward the Greek-speaking world of the eastern Mediterranean. Alexander stayed only briefly. When he died in Babylon in 323 BC, his empire had no stable adult heir, and his generals divided its territories while claiming to act in the name of his family. Egypt fell under the control of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable commanders. Ptolemy understood that possession of Alexander's body could carry enormous symbolic power, so he arranged for it to be brought to Egypt, where it was eventually placed in a royal tomb at Alexandria. The exact location of that tomb has been lost, adding another mystery to a city whose ancient streets now lie partly beneath modern buildings and the sea. In 305 BC, Ptolemy declared himself king, becoming Ptolemy I, and founding a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks, and their court spoke Greek, practiced Greek forms of kingship, and married within the royal family to preserve dynastic control. Yet, inside Egyptian temples, they appeared in the ancient pose of pharaohs, wearing traditional crowns, presenting offerings to the gods, and defeating enemies beneath divine protection. This was not merely costume. Egyptian priests controlled sacred knowledge, temple wealth, local influence, and the ceremonies that made kingship legitimate. The Ptolemies needed their cooperation, while the priesthoods needed rulers willing to fund temples and protect their estates. The result was a political partnership expressed in 2 languages and 2 visual worlds. A king could be a Hellenistic monarch in Alexandria and a pharaoh at Edfu, without seeing a contradiction. Under the early Ptolemies, Egypt became one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the Mediterranean. The state carefully managed agriculture, taxation, trade, and royal monopolies, drawing revenue from the fertility of the Nile Valley. Grain left Egyptian ports for cities across the sea, while papyrus, glass, linen, stone, luxury goods, and crafted objects moved through Alexandria's markets. The city grew into a crowded capital of palaces, harbors, warehouses, temples, workshops, and neighborhoods inhabited by Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, merchants, sailors, officials, soldiers, and travelers from distant lands. The lighthouse on the island of Pharaohs became one of the most famous structures of the ancient world, guiding ships toward a harbor filled with wealth and danger. Alexandria was also associated with the Mouseion and the Great Library, institutions supported by the royal court to gather texts and attract scholars. The library's destruction is often imagined as one dramatic fire that erased the knowledge of the ancient world in a single night. But the evidence points to a more complicated decline, involving damage, political instability, neglect, and changes over time. Its importance lay not in possessing every book ever written, but in representing a new ambition. Rulers could collect knowledge as they collected territory. Greek and Egyptian traditions also influenced one another. The god Serapis combined elements that could speak to both communities, while the cult of Isis spread far beyond Egypt into the wider Mediterranean. At the same time, traditional Egyptian religion remained active in temples whose walls continued to be carved with hieroglyphs. Some of Egypt's best-preserved sacred buildings, including major parts of Edfu, Dendera, Kom Ombo, and Philae, were built or expanded during the Ptolemaic and later Roman periods. Their relative lateness does not make them less Egyptian. They preserve rituals, myths, astronomical knowledge, and priestly traditions that reached back through centuries of adaptation. Yet beneath the image of prosperity, the Ptolemaic kingdom was unstable. Royal siblings married, competed, exiled one another, and sometimes fought civil wars that divided the country. Taxes could be heavy, local officials could be abusive, and rebellions periodically erupted, especially in Upper Egypt. Some Egyptian leaders established rival governments in the south, proving that Ptolemaic control was never as complete as court ceremonies suggested. The dynasty also became increasingly dependent on Rome. Roman politicians, generals, financiers, and diplomats interfered in royal succession because Egypt's grain and wealth were too valuable to ignore. By the 1st century BC, the Ptolemaic court still possessed enormous resources, but its independence survived partly because powerful Romans had not yet agreed on who should control it. Into this dangerous world came Cleopatra VII. She became queen in 51 BC, initially ruling with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, according to dynastic custom. Cleopatra was not the first queen of her name, nor was she the first powerful woman to rule Egypt, but she became the most famous because her struggle unfolded at the moment Rome was tearing itself apart. Ancient sources describe her intelligence, political skill, persuasive speech, and ability to communicate in several languages. Later tradition claimed that she was the first member of her dynasty to learn Egyptian, though that detail cannot be proven with complete certainty. What is clear is that she presented herself not only as a Greek queen, but also as an Egyptian ruler, closely identifying herself with Isis and participating in temple traditions. Her image was political. To Greek subjects, she was a Hellenistic monarch descended from Alexander's world. To Egyptian priests and communities, she could appear as a legitimate pharaoh, protecting the gods and the land. Her reign began in conflict. Cleopatra was pushed out of power by advisors supporting Ptolemy XIII, just as the Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey reached Egypt. Pompey sought refuge there after defeat, but he was murdered upon arrival by men hoping to please Caesar. Instead, the killing offended Caesar and drew him directly into the dynastic struggle. Cleopatra secretly gained access to him in Alexandria, an episode later dramatized with the famous image of her being carried inside a carpet or bedding roll. The precise details may have been embellished, but the political result was real. Caesar supported her claim, fighting in Alexandria while the city became a battlefield. Ptolemy XIII died during the conflict, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now ruling with another younger brother. She later gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion, whom she presented as Caesar's child. Caesar never publicly established him as a Roman heir, but for Cleopatra, the boy connected Egypt's dynasty to the most powerful man in Rome. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, the Roman world entered another civil war. Cleopatra eventually allied herself with Mark Antony, one of the leading Roman commanders and a member of the ruling triumvirate. Their relationship was personal, but it was also a calculated alliance. Antony needed Egypt's wealth, ships, and grain for his eastern campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman protection and hoped to restore territory once controlled by the Ptolemies. Together, they had children and built a political partnership that alarmed Antony's rival Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian understood the power of narrative as well as any pharaoh. Rather than present the coming war simply as another conflict between Roman leaders, he portrayed Antony as a man corrupted by an Eastern queen who threatened Rome itself. Cleopatra became the target of propaganda depicting her as seductive, extravagant, foreign, and dangerously ambitious. Much of the popular image that followed her was shaped by writers loyal to the side that defeated her. This does not mean she was a misunderstood innocent. She was a determined ruler prepared to use wealth, dynastic marriage, religion, and war to preserve her kingdom. But she was also facing an expanding Roman state whose resources no Egyptian ruler could match alone. The decisive confrontation came in 31 BC near Actium, on the western coast of Greece. The naval battle was complex, and the reasons Antony and Cleopatra withdrew remained debated, but Octavian's victory destroyed their ability to continue the war effectively. They returned to Egypt while allies abandoned them and Roman forces closed in. In 30 BC, Octavian entered Alexandria. Antony, believing Cleopatra dead or faced with final defeat, took his own life. Cleopatra died soon afterward. Ancient writers famously claimed that she used the bite of an asp, but the exact method remains uncertain. Poison may have been involved, and the snake story carried powerful symbolism because the cobra was linked with Egyptian royalty. Her tomb has never been securely identified. Caesarion was killed on Octavian's orders, ending the Ptolemaic male line, while Cleopatra's surviving children by Antony were taken to Rome. Egypt became a Roman province, its wealth placed under the direct control of the new ruler who would soon be called Augustus. Yet, the death of Cleopatra did not cause Egyptian civilization to disappear. Roman emperors continued to be shown as pharaohs on temple walls, even though many never visited the country. Priests still performed rituals, festivals still filled sacred spaces, and hieroglyphs continued to be carved. Egyptian religion spread through the Roman world, especially the worship of Isis, while Alexandria remained a major center of trade and learning. Change came gradually. Greek and later Coptic gained wider use, Christianity spread, temple economies weakened, and old cults lost official support. The last known dated hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in AD 394, more than 4 centuries after Cleopatra's death. Soon afterward, the ability to read the ancient script faded, and the voices preserved on temple walls fell silent until their decipherment in the modern age. The civilization of the pharaohs had not ended in one battle or one queen's final night. It had transformed slowly, layer by layer, until its symbols remained visible, but their meanings were forgotten. And this may be the most extraordinary truth in the entire history of ancient Egypt. Cleopatra lived closer in time to us than she did to the builders of the Great Pyramid. To her, Khufu was already a figure of remote antiquity. Egypt was never one unchanging civilization frozen beneath the desert sun. It was a world that repeatedly broke apart, absorbed foreign rulers, changed its gods, rebuilt its state, and reimagined what it meant to be Egyptian. The pyramids survived because they were made of stone, but the civilization survived for so long because it knew how to change without completely abandoning its past. Pharaohs vanished, temples closed, and sacred words were forgotten, yet the ancient promise remained fulfilled. They built so their names would be spoken, and thousands of years later, the world is still speaking them. From the Nile's first settlements to Cleopatra's final stand, Egypt's story reminds us that civilizations endure through memory, change, and wonder. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe to Sleepy Hidden History.